seconds later.
1 minute, 37 seconds later.
5 minutes later. 5 minutes later. 5 minutes later. 11 minutes later.
12 seconds later.
15 minutes later.
20 minutes later. 346 minutes later.
A few minutes later. A little longer than a few minutes later. 2 very boring minutes later. 1 hour later.
1 hour later!
1 hour later.
1 hour later. 2 hours later.
2 hours later. 2 hours later.
2 hours later.
2 hours later. 2 hours later.
2 hours later.
3 hours later.
3 hours later.
3 hours later. 3 hours later.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
5 hours later.
6 hours later. 6 hours later. 6.5 hours later.
7 hours later. 8 hours later.
8 hours later.
24 hours later. 24 hours later.
48 hours later. 72 hours later.
Many hours later. The following day.
The next day. Several days later.
The next day. The next day.
Day 2. Day 3. Day 4.
3 days later.
3 days later.
3 days later.
3 days later.
4 to 6 days later. 4 to 6 more days later. 1 week later. 2 weeks later.
1 week later. 3 weeks later. 3 weeks later.
75 years later.
2,000 years later.
3,000 years later.
Later that same evening. Tomorrow. Tomorrow for sure. Eventually.
Meanwhile. Moments later.
A few moments later. A few inches later.
Moments later.
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 Later. Later.
A little later. More moments later.
Much later.
Much later. Much later. An extremely annoying shift later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
1 eternity later.
Just then. Montage. Flashback. End of flashback.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying.
Gusto mo bang malaman kung paano i-download ang bidyong ito? Meron akong tutorial na ginawa para sa'yo at nilagay ko dyan sa description ang link. Kaya pumunta na sa description at i-click ang link. Thank you for watching. This is Kuya Ed. Always remind you, you are great.
Thank you.